Good morning. So, earlier this week, when I opened the text up and started reading, I quickly realized why Melissa had passed this text on to me. Okay? It happens to be one of the most difficult texts, and it's especially difficult for Episcopalians. And I'm not talking about today's gospel. I'm talking about Paul's letter to the Ephesians, the part where it says, "Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery." Okay? Thought that was a little bit of a challenge for some Episcopalians. And over the past month, I'd say, we've been really exploring John's gospel and seeking to go a little bit deeper and look at the metaphorical language and what we can take from the text. And I think that that's the same thing with this particular line, this line about getting drunk. I think that's what Paul, or he who wrote this letter, was getting at, was those stumbling blocks that get in our way. It's not about drinking a little too much at a party or at a dinner. So what I'd like to do is go in a little bit more detail on Ephesians. We've been really focusing on John, so let's just take a quick look there. Before we get started, though, I wanted to give you a little background about Paul's letter to the Ephesians. It is considered a Deutero-Pauline letter. And what that means is today's modern scholars have deduced that this letter might not have actually been written by Paul. It's actually a compilation, or possibly could be a compilation, put together of many of his letters and composed by one of his disciples. And it's believed that this letter was put together that way as maybe like a, I don't want to say marketing piece, but a instructional piece for new Christian communities. And so it has this really broad focus on how new Christian communities can work together. And so what I thought I would do was read just a couple of the past Ephesians lessons, not the whole thing, just a couple of quick blurbs, just to remind us of some of that instruction that we find. Paul says, "I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." In last week's lesson, Paul says, "Be imitations of God as beloved children, and live in love as Christ loved us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." And that leads us to today's lesson. We are asked to look at our own lives. It says, not to be unwise, but as wise people, making the most of our time. Again, saying not to get drunk, but be filled with the Spirit as you sing psalms and hymns, singing and making melody to the Lord in your hearts. So over the past week, I've really been turning this over, trying to think of a really good message I can give you, and how we might better live in Christian community and what that looks like. I think that the letter, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, or what has been composed here from his letters, is really asking us to take a deeper look and instruct us on how to live better together. And the first thing that came to mind was just how hard that is, just how much of a struggle that is, how much that really gets in our face. And I think that when you think about living in community together and you think about your relationships, the first place we can often go to is pointing our fingers at others, blaming other people. I know that that's true for myself. I was considering sharing a personal story today. I know that that's a great way to connect, and I realized that the story and the struggles I've had this week were a little too personal, and sharing them up on the podium here might not be very respectful of those that I'm in communication with. So I'm not going to share specifically about what I went through this week in terms of a relationship that I'm personally working on. But what I realize I could share with you is what I'm learning as I go through that process, and what I'm seeing. And what I noticed is, again, the pointing the fingers at other people in my life and expecting them to do things for me, expecting them to, I guess you could say, read my mind, and really noticing an opportunity to be responsible and step back for a little bit and be responsible for my own actions. I realize that the change that we often want to see in our life, the change that we often want to see in the community that we're in, the change that I experienced, that I wanted to make, it wasn't change that other people in my life were going to do. It wasn't the change that they were going to make. Ultimately, it's the changes that I had to make. So ultimately, I guess what I'm saying is sometimes we have to kick ourselves in the butt. I think Gandhi says it very well. He says, be the change that you want to see in the world. So I just want to invite you this week to take a look into your life and to look at those relationships that you might be butting up against. You might be butting up against relationships with yourself. You might be butting up in a relationships with your parents, sister-in-law, with your mother. And you might be finding yourself pointing the finger at them. You might find that yourself upset with them. And I invite you to have a conversation with yourself and to be honest with yourself and to be responsible for where you might be responsible for your own actions, and take that to the conversation. That you might be able to bring that wisdom to the table.